Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We are an open dialogue on culture and ideas. And we are actually now this will be the beginning of our 10th year as a show. We are a show that focuses on education, on the arts, on social change. Those are the three categories we like to focus on. We're not a breaking news show, but we do like to talk about politics and what's going on, but we like to talk about it in a more substantive way. And that's why we love to have Professor Stephen Bronner on our show, who is a Governor's professor at Rutgers University, where he teaches political science, and he's an author of over a dozen books, and his specialty area is socialism, and that's a big word. You're going to hear a lot about socialism. You've been hearing a lot more about it these days. We heard about it from President Trump during the State of the Union address, and he talked about it as if we're like in 1953, and this McCarthyistic bashing of socialism is bad, and yet there we have in the Congress AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She doesn't have horns on her head, I don't think. I haven't seen any horns on her head, but and Bernie Sanders. So we want to get into a nice, in-depth analysis through our dialogue and see if Professor Bronner, he's a friend, Steve's a dear friend, can share some of his insights and from his books. In particular, he wrote a book about critical theory, which is something that I think you're going to hear more about as time goes by and as we have this kind of shift to the left, or the Democratic Party now is not afraid of going further left as they once were very centrist. Now we see all kinds of changes happening, and with that being said, I welcome Steve to our show. Quick analysis on the breaking news, on what's happening today with Donald Trump in the White House and with the new acceptance of socialism. Is this the new normal?
Well, what's really remarkable, I think, is that the word is used. It's always been a mantra for the mainstream Democrats, and even for left Democrats, don't say socialism. And now it seems that this is becoming a concept that's useful. And I think part of the reason is because of the amount of government action that was taken under the Obama administration. I think that was really the first step. And the attack on the 99% by Occupy Wall Street that was then taken up by the Democratic Party, I think this sort of set the stage. That Donald Trump attacked socialism as vehemently as he did shows that there's something there. I've always thought that the extent to which the enemy takes you seriously is a way of helping define how far you've come. Now the problem for socialists or for people on the left of the Democratic Party is I think we have to define better what it means. And people are very unclear about it, in part because of the legacy of the Soviet Union and its use of the term. This is a different socialism, like any other ideological movement. Socialism has many different strands. It has the communist strand. That's one way of looking at it. It has a kind of anarchist strand, which sort of you could see in Occupy Wall Street, but that's a long way. Lenin's original slogan, after all, was all power to the Soviets. A Soviet is a workers' council and a decentralized form of control over the community. At any rate, the third mainstream is what's usually called social democracy or democratic socialism. And what's very interesting is that this is the perhaps the oldest part of the socialist tradition, and yet this is what's becoming big now. And the way to think about this, I think, is that it has three components. The first is the welfare state, which I think has been approached in much too narrow a fashion. The welfare state isn't just about redistributing money or helping the poor. What the welfare state is about is making life more livable. It makes life more secure through things like social democracy, through the idea of national health insurance and the like. But it can go further. You can talk about government-sponsored travel. You can talk about older people, perhaps like us, being given a helper when they get older. Why not? You can talk about a guaranteed income, which shortens the work week. It's not just that you get the money; it's that in some way, life becomes a little better. And the model for this, of course, is really Scandinavia, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, and the like. And I gave a talk in Sweden once, and one of the things that I found remarkable, it's very tough to pin down. People were sort of more active in terms of, and young people. Every young person I met had a hobby. People worked, had better hours. The work conditions were better. And so in a certain way, what the welfare state is about is tempering what I call the whip of the market. And making, as I say, making life more livable. So the first thing is the welfare state. The second thing, though, within social democracy and the social democratic tradition, is a defense of liberal values and the republic. This was in the case actually already in the 19th century. It's very interesting. Social democracy grew rapidly. In Germany, for example, at the last quarter of the 19th century, it grew from 900,000 to 4 million by 1912. And that was the same all over Europe. When one talked about the social question, one was actually talking about socialism. And what's interesting is that after the First World War, it was precisely these socialist parties which served as the base for all the new republics in Austria, in Germany, Czechoslovakia, everywhere. And the commitment to liberal Republican principles, I think, is one of the most important things that's around today. Defense of voting rights, free speech, due process. These are all things that we sort of, in the United States, tend to take for granted. Each one of those achievements can be rolled back. Rosa Luxemburg, the great libertarian socialist of the early 20th century, she once said that reform is like the labor of Sisyphus. In other words, you roll the rock up the hill, but the rock can also roll down the hill. And we have to be aware that all those achievements of the civil rights movement and even in the 60s, each one has to be defended. Otherwise, it's going to be taken away. So the second part of the social democratic tradition is a defense of the liberal republic. And now comes the third part, and that's the most difficult, I think. The third part is a question of values. How do we want to live? Do we want to live as provincial, small-minded people obsessed with their own roots and own traditions, or do we want to look outward? Do we want a cosmopolitan, internationalist outlook? Do we want to build peace? Because after all, it's the workers of the world who fight one another. You don't see the sons and daughters of the elite, for example, Donald Trump, going and fighting a war. In a certain way, this emphasis on peace, sometimes it didn't work out for social democracy, as in the case of the First World War. But by and large, the tradition of social democracy is to further international understanding and build cultural exchanges between countries. And what that means is learning about other cultures and other nations. I once asked one of my classes, an upper-level class at Rutgers, and I'm very proud of my students. I said, can one of you guys name a Japanese author of importance? Nobody. There's something wrong with that, right? There's something seriously wrong with that. Can you name a major Chinese politician? Tried that also. One kid said Mao Zedong. All right, it's a step in the right direction.
Somebody.
But there's something wrong with that too, yeah? While we obsess over our roots, I mean, there's a whole ideological element to this. Because if you want to talk about roots and you want to talk about traditions, you're also going to talk about prejudices. They're built into it. And so if you talk about tradition, you're going to talk about sub-traditions. How do you make choices between those? And I think from a socialist standpoint, what you're going to be emphasizing is the need for cosmopolitan values. How do you relate to the other? Yeah? It's no accident that social democracy stood in the forefront, not so much in the United States, I might add, but stood in the forefront of general concerns with racism, with anti-Semitism, and the like. This is also built into the tradition. For example, a lot of social democrats were supportive of Oscar Wilde. Yeah. And although if you think of the Dreyfus affair, where the famous anti-Semitic...
That's not Richard Dreyfuss, though.
That's not Richard Dreyfus.
That's the other Dreyfus.
No, this is the 19th century.
Explain that, yeah.
Yeah, this was about a Jewish captain and the French chiefs, among the French chiefs of staff. And this was a period right after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, which France lost. There was great paranoia. Military secrets were given over to Germany, and Alfred Dreyfus was blamed. And it was a setup, just to make a long story short. Everybody knows about this, or the extent to which people know about it is usually through the great writer Émile Zola, who wrote I Accuse, J'accuse. But in fact, one of the forgotten heroes of this was Jean Jaurès, who was head of the Social Democratic Movement, Socialist Party in France, and Léon Blum, who would be his successor. This is just a small example of what I'm talking about. So now we have three parts to socialism, to social democracy. We have the welfare state, we have a defense of liberal Republican principles, and we have a commitment to, shall we say, racial tolerance and a cosmopolitan, what I call a cosmopolitan sensibility. Here's what you can't have. You can't have a situation where people are obsessed with their own identity at the expense of others. And now we have a situation in which you see many groups pitted against one another. It happens often enough. Blacks often pitted against Latinos, pitted against gays. Problems with the women's movement. We saw that in the recent Women's March. What I think the commitment is for the future is, if we want to talk socialism, you have to talk class. And if you talk class, it's no longer the way it was in the 19th century, where you could see the working class growing and becoming stronger and the like. No. Today, what we're talking about is a kind of ethic of building class consciousness. And I call this the class ideal. And the class ideal has to be concrete. And so what I would suggest is, what we need is the articulation of programs that speak to the working people within each of the new social movements. Women, Latinos, blacks, etc., that speaks to each of the working people in each of these movements without privileging any. In other words, nobody gets
Higher, lower, nobody, yeah.
Right. We need programs that speak to all the working people in all these movements. And that's a tough fight. And what that means is that it's, since obviously I or you are not going to be able to walk into a black community or a women's meeting and say, look here, you got to talk class. It's got to be women who go into their meetings, blacks who go into their community, Latinos who go into their community, who talk about the class ideal, and that's how I see it.
Wow. We're getting a feast of ideas here. We're getting a genuine intellectual here. This is Steve Bronner is not a pundit, okay? I think what we have in our mainstream media is an overdosing on punditry. And punditry doesn't go deep enough. I think that's part of the problem now. So I would hope that at some point you would be discovered by the big shows, as they say, and reach a broader audience, you know, with this analysis, rich, deep, complex analysis, connecting the dots between culture and politics and history. You don't get this on mainstream media. However, it fulfills a function. But I think what I would like to think about and talk about is, and I think in some way, the fact that Trump has emerged, I like to see it as a silver lining in some way, if I may, that, hey, the system is broken, man. Look, we have an embodiment of this, the most unqualified person ever to assume the office of the presidency, and he, you know what I'm saying? And I think so. We have to take a really serious look at our educational system, at a fundamental restructuring of the educational system, of the media. And it's interesting that today, when Elizabeth Warren declared her candidacy for president, and she chose Lawrence, Massachusetts, where the old Right, exactly. The old labor movement began there with the women on strike. She chose that site, and she kept using the word structure. We need new structures. And you've been talking about new structures for many, many years. So, yeah.
We used to have an idea as socialists. Well, the answer to every issue is abolish private property. There are a lot of problems with that. First of all, it has an incredibly negative connotation. We can't even abolish gun control, or we can't even introduce gun control. But the second thing is, nationalization doesn't solve every issue. The issue isn't, in my view, it's not there. Capitalism no longer works in its pure form. The state's always involved. The question is, what policies is the state going to pursue? And also, connected with that, what are the priorities of production? Where should the state step in? For example, the way things are going now, we are talking about the complete destruction of the planet,
Yes.
right? Through through sort of everybody trying to make it on its own. The government could subsidize, and here President Obama took important first steps. The government could subsidize a serious environmental program. AOC,
Yes.
You know, I love that.
We love her.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put forward a green New Deal. That's the kind of thing we want to see. That's the kind of thing we want to see. And the second thing I'd like to say is, when we think of Trump, in my opinion, anyway, you're quite right about the lack of competence. It's absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah.
But it's been a mantra of liberal politics in the United States to make the claim, oh, listen, we have to move towards what Arthur Schlesinger called the vital center. Yeah. And the greatness of American politics is we never had a communist movement of any great strength, and we never had a fascist movement of any great strength. Electorally, that's true. Socially, it's absurd to make this kind of argument. Because you think back, there's always been a Trump. You go back to the 19th century. There were the beginning of the 19th century, 1830s, 40s. There was the Know-Nothings. After the Know-Nothings comes the Ku Klux Klan, right? After the Ku Klux Klan comes the America Firsters. After the America Firsters comes McCarthyism. After McCarthyism comes the moral majority.
George Wallace, too.
Oh, yeah, the Dixiecrats, exactly right. And segregation in general. And then we have the moral majority, the silent majority, the whatever, religious majority.
Right.
In a certain way, all of these groups, in my opinion, I mean, we don't want to, become too esoteric, but they all roughly come from the same places. And they all roughly have the same class base. That's not an accident. And they all roughly have the same ideology. Anti-immigrant, anti-black, or anti-people of color, excuse me, anti-intellectual, anti-East, and anti-elitist, often anti-capitalist.
Really?
Yeah. In terms of populism, whether of the right or the left. And that's true, you see it in Europe today. It's not like they're embracing the huge corporations or anything like that. They embrace the people. But what does that mean? because what if there are contradictions within the people, class contradictions? You got to have a way to articulate that, and you have to have a way to resolve those contradictions. But first, you got to be able to see them. You know, populists can't.
Well, the last two pieces that I wrote, because I write as a way to help myself think these issues through, you know. I wrote a piece on education, calling for a fundamental transformation of the educational system, and I wrote a piece about Trump. Well, I said that Trump hates socialism. Lucky for socialism. You know, it's like to have a boogeyman like that means that maybe there's an opportunity here. I'm thinking, like, in terms of, is there a resurgent left now? Do you see with AOC and her popularity calling for a 70% hike? I never thought I would see that. You know, when we said that 5 years ago, even a year ago, you know, you say that, and to people who, even at the family table, they think you're crazy. You know, what is this? This is crazy. But to say 70%, something has changed, you know. So I think, is this cause for celebration, or am I being too optimistic?
Oh, I think it's. I think that's very, very positive. Can the left blow it? Oh. No problem at all.
They need you to coach them.
Well, I don't know about that, but what certainly they need is they have to walk a fine line. We as socialists. Yeah. On the one hand, we can't simply give in to the liberal and centrist elements within the Democratic Party. That's on the one hand.
Such as who? Let's name names. Biden?
Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, you'll see people coming up who are further to the right. You think of Ben Nelson, or some of these, some people from the Midwest. Some, not all, not Sherrod Brown. On the one hand, we have to oppose that. Joseph Crowley, whom Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez beat in the primary, he would be an example. We have to be clear in terms of articulating what we want, and that means being critical of the right wing of the Democratic Party. On the other hand, what we can't do is what the Green Party has done so often, which is be sectarian. Yeah, the idea that there's no difference between, let's say, Joe Biden, vice president under President Obama and a senator, and Trump is simply crazy. I mean, there's no other way to say it. Hegel had a great line for this. He said, basically, to deny these kind of differences, you wind up living in the night in which all cows are black. You can't distinguish anything. And you wind up living in the night in which all cows are black.
All cows are black. Okay.
Or the twilight in which all cats are gray.
Okay.
And basically what that means is you're walking around in such a way that you can't distinguish anything, right? It's like you're flailing out at everything, and that doesn't work. So we have to be clear. Fight against the conservative wings within the Democratic Party. Try and win. Get our candidates. Give our candidates and our people support. But at the end of the day, if we don't win within the Democratic Party, if there's a candidate, no candidate is going to be perfect anyway. We have to make sure to get the vote out against neo-fascists like Trump. I don't think there's any question about it. And you think of those states that Trump won in the last election against Hillary Clinton, and I am not a shill for Hillary. No. But you think of those 3 or 4 states which determined the election. Jill Stein of the Green Party had more votes than Trump won by in each of those states. To draw the implications is very bad, if you know what I mean.
Well, it is always such a joy and pleasure to be here with you, Steve, with the professor. You're going to have to give me your tuition bill later because, I tell you, I couldn't afford this guy's class at Rutgers, and there are people from all over the world who come, sign up for this man's class. He gives talks all over the world. We're always just grateful to have you on the show, that we could put this knowledge out into the world. And again, this is at a time in our country when our educational systems are moving away from the humanities. We think that has to stop. That is got to end right now. We had Harold Bloom on our show last year, the great literary critic, and he was denouncing the universities for turning away from literature. We had Stanley Fish, another great literary critic, who says, we got to bring back the humanities. We got to make the humanities a again, and so we're doing that with you right now, putting this curriculum out on TV, onto YouTube land, wherever it's going to go. People watching this can be nourished, hopefully then can go and read your books and read other people's books. But Claudia, I want to just pan the camera around, my darling. Just look at the books on the shelf. It's always good. We have to situate this in time and space here. We are not just in a decontextualized, Rockefeller Center kind of bubble where we are in an apartment in Fort Lee, New Jersey. We are in a lovely apartment here near the GW Bridge with a great professor at Rutgers, Stephen Bronner, who's also involved in an organization called Academics for Peace, U.S. Academics for Peace, and I find that my friendship with you is very stimulating, and I thank you so much. He said for him as well, too. I want to make sure you caught that. Okay, yeah, I want to make sure you caught that. So I began my reading year, because I actually read books. Steve reads books. It's good to say it's important to read books, especially when you have a president who doesn't read. Must be said. I began my reading year, reading a biography of Goethe.
Oh my!
Goethe, and. And now we're going to see a Shakespeare play tonight. We're going to see the Comedy of Errors in Hoboken at Stevens University. It's a very, cheap way to get the theater. I'm reading the Comedy of Errors. Talk a little bit about, what you advise the people out there and young people, and let's say people who studied business, maybe, and now they want to
just
broaden themselves. What would you say? A rich, critical education to save democracy. Let's start with that. Yeah.
Well, it's always a difficult question because, you have your biases and you have your likes and dislikes and so on. Mm-hmm. I think a great place to start for young people is a series that Oxford University Press put out. I have a little book in it called Critical Theory. But it's called the Oxford University Press series of very short introductions. They're all written at the same length. They're all about 100 pages. They all have 10 photos. And they're really beautifully done. They have wonderful people writing these things. And they're about, I think at this point, 300 books, maybe even a few more, on the most varied topics, from literary theory to light or water or Mozart or it's amazing, the environment, and they've done an absolutely brilliant job with that. The level's high. Yes. It's not just an introduction, because you get a wrap, so to speak, on each topic, an interpretation, and yet it's a wonderful, they're wonderful introductions. That I think is how where I would suggest people start. The other thing I think that's important, at least it was important for me, was reading really good intellectual histories. You get a lot of bang for the buck, so to speak. And a lot of these intellectual histories by people like, I don't know if you remember H. Stuart Hughes, who ran for the Peace and Freedom Party in the 60s, ran for president. He was a wonderful historian and a great writer. And these things can be found. And you pick your period, you pick your area, and you see what you can find. I just picked up a book on the Islamic Enlightenment, and it's an intellectual history. So I think that would be an interesting place to start.
You just made me think about Thomas Bender. Thomas Bender, who was a guest on our show in 2011, he wrote this wonderful book on the intellectual history of New York, how New York became the world intellectual and cultural capital, and it's really about the rise and decline of that. Now, he wrote this book in 1987, and already he felt that the New York intellectual level was in serious decline because of the corporate takeover of the society. So we had him on our show. So, intellectual history, I think, is very, very key. So you also have a great expertise and interest in foreign policy, Steve.
Yeah.
I took a course in foreign policy at Bergen Community College when I was a liberal arts major at the beginning of my college career, and I just never forgot that class and go back to it. So I always tell young people, liberal arts, take liberal arts. It's a wonderful thing. I used to be embarrassed by it when I was young. People would say, "What are you studying?" "Oh, liberal arts." I'd say it like really embarrassed, No, liberal arts. That's important stuff. So, in the world of foreign policy, one thing we like to say is we should get rid of all nukes. We've had a guest on our show, Alice Slater, who is on the forefront of to abolish all nuclear weapons. So, what's happening in the world of foreign policy?
Well, there's a lot going on in foreign policy, but this much I think is of interest.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like this with Trump. This is, if you're going to pick a unique aspect of his presidency, this might be it. Because there's no coherence at all. It's, there's some people, they spout the opinion of the last person they talk to. Here you have a situation where the president is spouting the opinion of the last TV show he's seen.
Oh, shit.
And
it's usually Fox News.
And it's usually Fox News. And it's sort of jumping around from one thing to the other. In my opinion, there isn't a single positive development that's emerged with Trump's foreign policy. Even with President Bush, whom I really opposed. I've done a few books on foreign policy. Blood in the Sand is one, and Peace Out of Reach is another. But even President Bush, he had neoconservatives who were pretty hawkish. I mean, John Bolton is one of them. But at least they had a coherent worldview. At the moment, you have nothing at all. It's like you have one tactic after the other put forward, but no strategy to hold them together. Yeah, and it's bad because predictability is part of how you present yourself to the world. You know, what we can see is that Trump the bully is at home is Trump the bully abroad. You know, and if you think of the difference between the foreign policy of President Obama and President Trump, it's like two different worlds. At the present, there's no multilateralism at all. In other words, cooperation with other nations. Our European allies I just spoke to a friend of mine in Belgium, and he said every time Trump's name is mentioned, people start laughing.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. Our closest traditional allies, and you think of England, or you think of Germany, or France, are being pushed away. And you ask yourself, and then there's the climate change, the withdrawal from climate change, treaties, the Paris Accords. And then you ask yourself, and this is, I think, the most serious thing. You ask yourself, who is it that Trump is actually working with? Everybody brings up Russia. But that oversimplifies. It's not just Russia. Trump is working with a set of dictators. And this is sort of very reminiscent of the 30s. Hitler and Mussolini had their disagreements, just like Trump and Putin have their disagreements. In fact, you can see that in Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator.
Yes.
That wasn't where he had those great scenes between the Hitler character and the Mussolini character. That wasn't made up. They did have disagreements. And they were rivals in certain ways, as Putin and Trump. Same thing with China. Yeah, there's a rivalry going on, but there's also a type of cooperation. Similarly, you can find that in the Philippines and in North Korea. And there's a, how should I put it, a bending in this manner, which is really something. There's a provocative assault on Iran, and which is really dangerous, and complete incoherence in Syria. If you want to withdraw troops from Syria or Afghanistan, that's great. I'm there. But you have to do it in a meaningful way. If one's going to fight ISIS, it's going to have to be, and I hate to say this, it's going to have to be with President Assad's regime and with Iran. If you want to fight the Taliban, if you want to put pressure, it's again going to be with Iran and Russia. There's no crisis in the Middle East, not the Palestinian-Israeli crisis, which also Trump has been a disaster on. There's not a single crisis in the Middle East, a single conflict, where Iran doesn't have a role to play. And I don't think one can get out of those conflicts peacefully without Iran. The idea, the kind of policy which, bellicose policy, which the Trump administration is pushing towards Iran is a crime, in my view. And I'm not a shill for Iran either. This is a very bad regime. But one has to, in some way, deal with that. You don't have treaties with your friends alone. You have treaties are meaningful with your enemies, because it's with them that you have to reach agreements. And Trump has just been awful in this regard, you know. And then you think of the caving into the Amen lobby, the AIPAC lobby on, in fact, it's to the right of the AIPAC lobby, what Jared Kushner has accomplished in Israel in that symbolic move of the embassy. It had no purpose other than to provoke the Palestinian people. And their situation's just getting worse. We have humanitarian crises all over the place. The United States could do so much, and it does nothing at all.
I think we're going to have to start a Steve Bronner for president campaign today. We might have to. What impresses me, Steve, is the breadth and depth of your knowledge in so many areas. You know, from economics to culture to foreign policy, and when you look at someone like a Trump, who is a kind of know-nothing, and when you look at the cabinet, when you go around that cabinet of sycophants who just, you know, they want to all bow down to the king. Gail Collins just did a wonderful column on, you know, who is the worst, who is the worst, you know, Trump cabinet member. But I could see someone like you maybe sitting around that table. If you know, if you had a cabinet position to pick, which would you gravitate towards, or is that a ridiculous question? Or
yeah, pretty ridiculous. But I guess just to answer the question, if I had one to pick, which I would which I would find most fascinating, would be Secretary of State.
Oh,
Yeah. That's an extraordinary position to be in, but I don't think we have to worry about me entering that position very soon.
Maybe Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is watching this. You never know. You know.
By the way, you know, you mentioned this with. It just occurred to me. You mentioned this with Trump and his people around him. My mother used to say, "Tell me who your friends are, and I'll tell you who you are." And that certainly works here.
As your mother growing up in Washington Heights, okay, she knew a thing or two. And we're also being filmed now by my darling wife, Claudia Canasto Chabuki. She's another Latina with 3 names. Gotta love those Latinas with 3 names, you know. And you know, Claudia actually taught me what the third name actually means. It's the mother. It's honoring the mother, the maternal side of the family, which is wonderful. And I think it's especially true at a time when we need nurturance, when we need the feminine side. It's amazing to see all these women rising up. And I hope it's a return to sanity in our politics, and I really champion that. I mean, we're a nonpartisan show, so we're not allowed to take sides in this way or that way. We want to be about culture and ideas, and it's such a great treasure to have you on. I feel like you sort of wake up my intellect, you know, when we have these conversations, and I think about what I want to do next. You know, I take a look at your bookshelf. Take a look at the bookshelf again, baby. You just take a look at that book. This is, ladies and gentlemen, books, very important, you know. When we had Stanley Aronowitz on our show, one of the great public intellectuals, you know, and I said, what advice would you have for the country? And he said, read, read, read. You know, it's like simple as that. Got to get back.
He's read a lot.
He has certainly read and written a lot. Yes, indeed. I always love the fact that when David Letterman, at the end of his, I think, 25 or 30-year run, he actually invited Cornel West to come on the show. And so having you on is like our equivalent of having Cornel West. And I actually saw you with Cornel in a recent Facebook post. You popped up with Mr. Cornel. You want to say a few words about that encounter, or?
That was a situation. I was going to a conference. It was near Columbia, and I ran into Cornell. We've known each other for 30 years or something like that. Yeah, we were in the early days. We met on a journal called Social Text. Both of us were on the board, but that's a long time ago. It's close to 40 years now. Yeah. And I'll tell you, as an intellectual, a lot of people, many who are jealous, talk about him as superficial and so on. Cornell is one of the really great intellectuals we have. He's somebody who spends a few hours every day reading. And it's for real. He thinks through ideas. You may not agree with him on everything, but he is genuinely a man of ideas, and the world's better to have him around.
My last class that I taught at Stevens Institute of Technology, I'm in the communications department there, and language and communications department, teaching ESL, English as a second language, to students mostly from China, who are all studying computers and engineering and things I know nothing about, but I'm there to help bring some humanization, to them and help them with their language. And I show Cornel West. I show a speech by Cornell, and it's like, oh my God, they can't believe it, and they're entranced by it, and the fact that he's speaking truth to power, because they're coming from a country where you can't do that. You wind up in jail if you do that. So yeah.
That's one of the things that makes the defense of liberal Republican principles so important. We have to remember this is a great advantage we have, and we have to use it and not be cynical about it.
Bernie Sanders made a speech not too long ago where he talked about the rise of authoritarianism around the world right now. So what can we do to beat that back?
I think what we have to do is go into coalitions.
Yeah.
We have to recognize who we are, but we have to be willing to work with potential allies.
Yes.
This is the great tradition of the Popular Front, which was opposed to fascism in the 30s, and I think we have to build on that. We have to be willing to speak to liberals. I even think we have to be willing to speak to rational conservatives.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean giving up who you are.
Right.
It means opening a dialogue and recognizing who the enemy is. And I'm sure of one thing, that unless we are adamant and unless we're consistent in the defense of civil liberties and the defense of due process and the defense of liberal Republican principles, every time the left has moved against that. Every time it's made an excuse for some two-bit dictator, whether it's in El Salvador or it's Nicaragua or Venezuela, every time we've done that, mistake, and big mistake.
Yeah, I wanted to. We only have about 5 minutes left, I think, but maybe 3 minutes left. Real quickly, what advice would you have for rich people who have like tons of money, billionaires? Don't you think some of that wealth can be used to create alternative structures of education, alternative structures of media, and to finance the good? Because I think Marx even said it, that you need to have allies at the top, in terms of
The ruling class has to break off before any revolution can occur. That's Marx's thing. I mean, I don't know what to say to a billionaire. This is a little beyond my pay scale. But certainly the protection of libraries, the expansion of knowledge, the support for humanitarian endeavors, Doctors Without Borders, things like that. Building hospitals, Danny Thomas, if you think of it. Or Steven Spielberg with his Shoah Foundation. That's very important. Things like this, rich people can be very useful. They're not the be-all and the end-all, but they can be very useful.
Well, Stephen, it's always such a great honor and pleasure to have you on our show, and I feel like I just earned my PhD by just talking to you. Okay, so thank you so much for watching us, and you can also Google Mr. Bronner and check out his Wikipedia and check out his wonderful books and check out some of our other shows with him, also on YouTube. And on behalf of my wife, Claudia Canasto-Chibuki, this is John Bredin for the Public Voice Salon. Thank you for watching. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.